Hey there, sports psych enthusiasts. I'm Dr. Colin Fehr, and I want to share my passion with you. I love talking about ways to unleash the power of the mind. This recording is part of a larger lecture series I've created in an effort to make sports psychology concepts more accessible to a larger audience. The information contained in this series is especially well suited for students of sports psychology and is presented in a way that makes for easy listening for all. Welcome to Sports Psych Concepts. Hey there, everybody. Welcome to this first rendition of the Sports Psych Concepts lecture series. Yes, I'm Dr. Colin Fehr. So glad to have you with me here. We've got a lot of great things to cover in this presentation. One of them being what is sports psychology itself. Funny thing, anytime I have an athlete who comes to see me who hasn't seen me before, one of the first questions that they have, or the lingering questions that they bring with them, is like, what is this? What is this all about? Like, I didn't really know what to think about this and what it was before I came, and now I'm so glad I have a better understanding of what it is. So I'm going to try and clarify some of that for you in this presentation. We'll talk about some of the notable figures in sports psych history. What are the origins? Where does all of that come from? Who are some of the pioneers that blazed the trail to get us to where we are right now as a profession? And then I will also go over the age-old question in the sports psychology world as what percentage of sports is mental? Like, it's a classic, and I think that my answer to that will probably surprise you. So then we'll go over how sports psychology is used, who uses it is also important. What are some careers in sports psychology? Those of you who might be interested in that you didn't even know what you could do, perhaps. And then I'll touch on some of the important organizations in the field. So with that, let's plow right ahead, shall we? Alrighty, so I want to start a with a question for you to pose, or just something for you to ponder. Okay, think about some memories that you've had in your own sporting experience. If you don't have a lot of sporting experience to pull from, then go to some other performance that you were in on the musical stage, for example, or giving some sort of speech, or presenting at a business conference, or maybe you're in a tactical situation, the law enforcement, military population. So think back to those performances, and in more specific than that, I want you to think back to your worst performance of all time. Now, I know some of you are going, "Oh, gross! Why would I want to think about that?" But I want to think about it. Like, what was it like? What did you feel? Some of you probably can conjure up the feelings right now. But what were you thinking? Okay, so now contrast that, your worst performance of all time, with your best performance of all time. Think about that. What was that like? What were you feeling during that performance? What were you thinking? How does that compare to your worst performance? Now, oftentimes, and this is a key concept for you to understand in the realm of sports psychology, oftentimes the major difference between our best and our worst performance is the thoughts inside our head. Powerful stuff. So now that we've got that out of our system, right, thinking about our worst performance, and then you notice the order there. I asked you to think about your worst performance and then think about your best performance. So we leave you with a good taste in your mouth. Little sports psych trick there for you. Always do that. Dabble maybe a little bit in the problem or the bad things, but then find a way to sort of magnify the good things. So with that, let's answer this question. What is sports psychology? Now, obviously, it's a scientific field, scientific study of people, their behaviors, right, in sport and exercise activities in particular. And then, importantly, the practical application of that knowledge. Okay, so sports psychology by itself is the study of those things. It's more of the sciencey background. Then you have applied sports psychology. How do we use it? Okay, so you have those two different branches of the same tree. Okay, now why? Like, why would we why do we need to understand this? Okay, or what are the sorts of questions that we can answer? And I'll go into this a little bit deeper too. But really, it's sports psychology is out there to help us understand the psychological factors that affect an individual's physical performance, but then also how participating in sport and exercise affect a person's psychological development or their health and their well-being, right? So it's this two-way sort of reciprocal relationship. How does our mind affect our performance? And then how does our participation in these different activities then affect our mind? Okay, it goes both ways, kind of a two-way street. So those are the types of things that we look at. It's not just about peak performance necessarily. It's what does participating in that mean for that person? How does that affect their development? Important things to understand as we move forward. So with that, let's shift now to some notable figures in sports psychology history. Now, I'm focusing mostly on North American history, but obviously there have been developments in other parts of the world. Okay, Eastern Europe had some significant and notable people over the course of the past couple of centuries. So important to acknowledge that. But the folks that I'm going to focus on here are North American figures. So the first is Norman Triplett. Okay, so he was around in the late 1800s, early 1900s. In by most accounts, he's kind of considered to be the guy who developed the original sports psychology study. Okay, so he had these cyclists that he noticed, just made this observation that they rode faster when they rode in pairs or in groups with other cyclists than they did when they were by themselves. And so he came up with this theory called social facilitation theory, right? It's like, wow, well, what's going on there? Like, what's happening? They go faster when they're with somebody else. Interesting, fascinating thing. Okay, he also did a study on youth with reeling in fishing line. And cast that line, wing it out there, and then they reel it in, and they would reel it in faster when there was the presence of another child. Okay, and a lot of his work was at the University of Indiana. So some of those original studies, that cycling one is just like hallmark classic study in sports psychology, came out of Norman Triplett. Then we had Coleman Griffith. Okay, so born in 1893, so still 1800s, but then lived a lot deeper into the 1900s, all the way to 1966. He's considered the father of American sports psychology. Okay, so he's the one who kind of took it to the next level somewhat, but he was a philosopher without disciples, or I'm trying to remember the expression of how he was described. Okay, but he didn't really have a lot of people to carry the banner after he moved into some different roles, more administrative roles at the University of Illinois where he was at. But he worked with the Chicago Cubs in 1938, but he kind of had a lot of resistance. So the team managers were kind of pushing back to his ideas, like, no, I think that we can do some stuff. And so didn't have a lot of success in what he was trying to do, but he really was an influential figure early on. And then we have this Franklin Henry was another character who he was more influential in the scientific development of sports psychology. So he founded one of the first grad programs. He trained others to use systematic research techniques to explore things. And then Bruce Ogilvie is considered to be the father of North American applied sports psychology. Okay, so more of the applied stuff. He worked with teams and athletes. He published one of the first applied books, so Problem Athletes and How to Deal with Them, right? So like every coach should read that book. How do we deal with those problem athletes? Like, what is it? Can you label an athlete a problem athlete nowadays? Like, interesting. Okay, but one sort of folklore story of him that I think is kind of hilarious is he actually was trying to gain access to the 1984 Olympic volleyball team that he was working with and trying to get more entry into understanding how things were. So he dressed as a women's volleyball player to go and hang around and be around more, so he could understand and see some of the psychological things that are going on there. So quite an extreme. And then we have Dorothy Harris, who was at University of Pennsylvania, I believe, or Penn State. Yeah, that's what it was. And so during the 1980s, and really helped it become its own field, right? It's more respected this time. So Dorothy Harris was the first female member of the International Society of Sports Psychology, and the president of the North American Sports Sociology organization. Okay, so she founded the first graduate sports psych specialization at Penn State, first research conference of women in sports in 1972. Same year Title IX legislation was passed. So all of these pioneers came a long ways. Some of the bigger organizations, Association for Applied Sports Psychology, formed in 1985. All of these different things that have happened throughout the course of the history that have established the field, and it's important to recognize the people who came before us, and some amazing people since the 1980s all the way to the present day that have made significant contributions to our knowledge and understanding of sports psychology from a scientific standpoint and an applied standpoint. All right, so now let's shift and ask ourselves some sports psych questions. Like, what are the types of things that we answer when we do sports psychology research or when we work with athletes as consultants? Well, one of the simple questions would be, well, how does anxiety, competition anxiety maybe in particular, how does that affect a golfer's putting accuracy? Because you can kind of subjectively rate, quantitatively, it's real subjective if it's self-rate, self-report, but you can get a rating of where someone's anxiety is and then have them do a putting task on the golf course or the putting green and see how that affects their performance, right? So we ask questions like that. Does lacking self-confidence influence a child's ability to learn to dance or to learn to hit a tennis serve or to learn to shoot a free throw in basketball? How does the coach's communication style affect team cohesion? Okay, so you have those sort of general questions on the one end of the spectrum, like I mentioned previously. How do these things affect our performance? But then the other side of it is, well, does participating in sport unlock some sort of inward potential? And you have a lot of people out there that argue sort of innately themselves, well, yeah, of course, participation in sport, it builds character and it does these things that you can't learn any other way. And then interestingly, you actually have some scholars who will argue the opposite of that. Like, no, sport doesn't inherently build character, right? So it's like, well, what's the question? Does sport do that? Does sport participation reduce anxiety and depression? Does participation in sport and athletics improve self-esteem? So these are some of the primary questions that we like to ask ourselves in the sports psych world. But we're also interested in theories and interventions, things that we can use to enhance performance, increase participation, retention, decrease attrition rates, and enhance personal growth. Okay, so always important to acknowledge that applied side of the equation. So now let's ask this question that I alluded to at the beginning. What percentage of sport is mental? Okay, I love this question. It's a classic sports psychology question. Any sports psych professor, instructor, enthusiast that likes to ask this question, okay, so we get the different question or different responses, okay? But so there was a couple of sports psychology consultants back at the 1988 Olympics, okay? They did this project called the Elite Athlete Project, and they profiled 1,200 athletes. Okay, and documented their results in a book called Beyond Strength, Psychological Profiles of Olympic Athletes. Okay, and what they found was that all of the athletes who were there at the Olympic trials, okay, is what they were looking at, athletes at Olympic trials, comparing those to those who made it at the Olympics. Okay, all those athletes at the Olympic trials were essentially identical in their physical gifts, right, in their sort of nutritional habits, all the different things that they did physically to promote optimal performance were nearly identical. Like, it was really hard to differentiate them. Okay, the differentiating factor between those athletes who actually qualified for the Olympics, so they made it out of the trials to the Olympics, versus those who just made it to the trials, okay, was the amount and frequency of mental training that they did in the days leading up to the Olympic trials and during the Olympic trials. So the difference for competitors at the highest level is mental. So with that idea in mind, right? Because you can ask sports psychology students or any layperson who has an interest in athletics and say, well, what percentage of sport is mental? Almost invariably, the responses are, well, it's at least 50%, but oftentimes it's more than that. Okay, 70%, some will say 90%, only 10% is physical, 90% mental, right? Whatever the different percentages, almost invariably it's at least 50%, but almost all the time more than that. Okay, and so the follow-up was like, well, okay, are you spending 50% of your time or 70% of your time just working on mental training? Are you really doing that? If it really matters that much, are we doing that? But to loop back to that elite athlete project that was carried out in the late 1980s is it's the difference. The mental attributes and practice and training, it is the difference. So I contend that success in sport is 100% mental, because any athlete, no matter what their physical talents are, what gifts that they have, it's going to take some sort of mental attribute, like making a decision, deciding to set a goal, and to work toward it, and putting forth the effort, which are all mental, psychological, behavioral concepts or ideas. Okay, it's all predicated on a mental thing. So to me, 100% of success in sport is mental. And Mia Hamm kind of backs me up here, saying the most important attribute a player must have is mental toughness. A lot of other athletes tend to agree with that. So there's the kind of an interesting idea for you. And plenty of you, obviously, we can get down to semantics. Like, well, like you got to have the physical gifts, but it's always going to be some mental idea or way of being that's going to determine whether 100% of those physical gifts are realized. So with that, I love to talk about Paavo Nurmi, the flying Finn. He set 22 official world records back when he was running. He won 9 gold medals, 3 silvers at 12 events in the Olympics, ranging from the 1,500-meter event to the 20K, which is just an incredible range for any sort of middle distance runner to be able to run that fast. And he has a famous quote that I love that captures what I was just talking about with what percentage of sport is mental. So what he said is, mind is everything. Muscle, pieces of rubber. All that I am because of my mind. So let that one sink in. Muscle, pieces of rubber. This guy who set 22 official world records, 9 gold medals. I might have known a thing or two about what it takes to be successful. So with that, let's transition to careers in sports psych. Not everybody knows about like what you can do. There's kind of 3 primary roles in the world of sports psych of what people can do. So there's the research, which is essential, really important thing that is done to understand what's going on in some sort of quantitative or qualitative sense, depending on how the research is being conducted. So you can go in qualitative approach, but I'm just going to go and ask a whole bunch of athletes, interview athletes and ask them, try and understand, and then I'm going to do this fancy coding process to try and figure out what the themes are of what they said, and then I'm going to build this model around this. Then maybe that can be tested quantitatively, so we can objectively measure that with a larger number of athletes. Okay, the research, all these different studies, how does that start out? Oftentimes it starts out qualitatively like that, and then you build a theory, and then you test the theory. Very important. Okay, so then you have the teaching side of it. So research, you go and read the Journal of Applied Sports Psychology, the sports psychologists, all these different journals that go out there and publish that. And then the teaching side of it, which is just like educational sports psychologists. These are actually usually kind of the many hats people. They do some research, they do some applied work, and then they teach the concepts in the classroom. And so they kind of got a hand in all of those different things. And then lastly, there's the consulting, which is the applied work. Okay. Now, I need to make a differentiation here between clinical sports psychologists, when we're talking about like applied, okay, clinical sports psychologists versus educational sports psych specialists. Okay, so a clinical sports psychologist comes from about either they're a licensed professional counselor or they're a licensed psychologist. Like technically, you're not supposed to use the term sports psychologist unless you have licensure as a psychologist. So you can be a sports psychology consultant. But you can't call yourself a sports psychologist unless you have that licensure. Okay, but you have the clinical side of practicing sports psychology work, which usually someone has a license and they can dabble more in sort of the underlying mental health concepts that might be there. And so that's an important differentiation between an educational sports psych specialist who they focus more on the surface level stuff. They might see that there's some deeper things going on that might be clinically significant, but they got to stay in their lane and their boundaries of competence. Okay, so there are differences right there. So most sports psych consultants that you see out working with a team, okay, they're dabbling there. They may not, they're probably not on the clinical side of it. Clinical sports psych people might also have a clinical practice where they work with just general mental health population and they work with athletes. It kind of depends. It can look a lot of different ways, but important to understand, okay, that distinction there. Now, who uses sports psychology? And this is another thing I just hinted at early on in the presentation. It really, I mean, I'd say sports psychology is for everyone. It really is. Military, combat, tactical populations, all those mental skills, they've got to have that stuff. You're going to work in a big business office, you're in a C-suite executive level that does all these presentations and has all these deadlines and pressure on you to perform and even compete at that level. You have competitors in the business world. It applies there. Musicians, it certainly applies there. Athletes, and I think the classic is just public speaking. That's like the number one fear, right? Is we're afraid to give presentations where all these people are listening. We can use some of these concepts, okay? But within the context of sports psychology itself, the realm of sport, that domain, elite athletes, the top level athletes, they all use this stuff. Mental skills training, they're doing those things. They may not have learned it formally from a sports psych consultant along the way, but they do those things. That's where we learn a champion's mind. What is their mind like? Where does that come from? That's where a lot of our understanding comes from, is those high level athletes. They use it. And if it's good enough for the best, it's probably good enough for the rest. All right, so almost wrapping up here, just want to hit on some important organizations here, and I'm just going to share these with you because these can be good to look into yourself if you have more interest in some of the organizations. So the organization I'm affiliated with is the Association for Applied Sports Psychology. Okay, but there's other organizations: North American Society for the Psychology of Sport and Physical Activity, the European Federation of Sports Psychology, International Society of Sports Psychology. All these organizations that are out there advancing the field, they have all these incredible resources for people who want to learn more about sports psychology. Go out there and dig into those and see what you can find out. Different resources for finding someone who is a sports psych consultant who could help you, or could help a kid that you know, or some athlete who needs a little bit of assistance on those things. That's what these organizations are out there for, to advance the field and promote research, rigorous research, and applied practice. So in review, we made it to this point. These are the things that we touched on. Just to rehash, we did go over the definition of sports psychology, what that is. Like I said, not everybody knows, has a great understanding, so you have that two-way direction that it goes of, well, how does these psychological ideas, constructs affect my performance, and then how does my participation in athletics affect the other way? We talked about notable figures, right, from Norman Triplett, Coleman Griffith, Bruce Ogilvie, all the way to Dot Harris, right? You got the whole range, and that's not even all encompassing. The importance of sports psych. How do we use sports psych, right? So if sport is 100% mental, or success in sport is 100% mental, we probably should use it. We need to understand how we can use it. And in later presentations that I'll cover in this series, I'll talk more about that, some specific interventions. The different sports psychology roles, so research, teaching, and consulting or applied. Those are kind of the three main areas. If you're looking to get at a career in sports psychology, different routes that you can go. And then some of those important organizations where you can go to find more information. So with that, we'll close it out. Thanks for listening all the way to this point. Sports psychology is amazing, wonderful field. Hopefully this was helpful to you and you want to get involved. If you want to get involved, then do some digging into those organizations and see what you can do. So good luck and talk again soon. Thank you for listening to this recording in the Sports Psych Lecture Series. I hope you learned something. More importantly, I hope you learned something that you can apply in your life. Feel free to share this presentation with others who might be interested. And if you're interested in more content like this, visit the Fehr Advantage channel on YouTube, or find the Fehr Advantage podcast on Spotify, or visit my website at fehradvantage.com.